Two big NATO powers, France and Germany, have said that Ukraine should be allowed to hit military sites inside Russia.
But only those Russian sites from which missiles are being fired towards Ukrainian territory, not other targets. That's the rider which has been given to Ukraine. Now, this comes amid Ukrainian President Zelensky's consistent pleas to the Western allies to allow using their weapons against military targets inside Russian territory. French President Emmanuel Macron further clarified that he is not escalating by extending his support to Ukraine, since it is Russia that is organizing itself in this way. During a joint news conference in Germany, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz backed Macron, saying that as long as Ukraine respected the conditions laid out by the countries that supplied those weapons, it was allowed to defend itself.
So we're staying exactly within the same framework. We think that we should allow them to neutralize the military sites from which the missiles are fired, and basically the military sites from which Ukraine is attacked. But we must not allow them to hit other targets in Russia, obviously civilian capabilities or other military targets.
Civils ou d'autres cibles militaires.
However, Russian President Vladimir Putin earlier warned the West that NATO members in Europe were playing with fire by proposing to let Ukraine use Western-supplied weapons to strike inside Russia.
Representatives of NATO countries, especially in Europe, especially in the small countries, they should be aware of what they are playing with. They should remember that as countries with small, densely populated territories. And this is a factor that they should keep in mind before talking about striking Russian territory.
Speaking during a state visit to Uzbekistan, Putin directly accused the US of wanting a global conflict.
He said the ground offensive being carried out by Moscow's forces in Ukraine's northeastern Kharkiv region is the result of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. He added, if Ukraine continues to strike residential areas, Russia will be forced to create security zones.
Everything now revolves around the events on the approaches to Kharkiv. So it was them who provoked these events in this direction. 6 months ago, I publicly said, if they continue to strike residential areas and neighborhoods, we will be forced to create security zones. And just recently, I said so. We moved on to this.
Meanwhile, the White House once again rejected Ukrainian president's request for an end to restrictions on Kiev using US-supplied arms to strike Russian territory. The US reiterated it does not encourage or enable US-supplied weapons to strike Russia.
There's no change to our policy at this point. We don't encourage or enable the use of US-supplied weapons to strike inside Russia.
Furthermore, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged US President Joe Biden to attend a peace summit, which is all set to be held in Switzerland in mid-June. He said Ukraine's key allies' absence would only be applauded by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to the report, Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris are set to miss the summit.
I think the peace summit needs President Biden, and other people who are looking at the response of the United States of America need him. If he is not present, it will be just like applauding Putin, personally applauding and doing so standing.
In the latest, Russian guided bombs killed 2 civilians in the eastern Ukrainian city of Toretsk on Tuesday and heavily damaged 2 multi-story apartment buildings. Pictures shared by Donetsk regional governor Vadim Filashkin showed damaged buildings and debris on the ground. Filashkin said that Russian forces deployed 3 bombs in the city.
For more on this, we're now being joined by John Erith, Senior Policy Director for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show, Mr. Erith. Now, the French President, along with the German Chancellor, have said that Ukraine should be allowed to use Western weapons to hit Russian targets, while we witnessed how Putin earlier warned the West, saying that the NATO members were playing with fire with such proposals. How do you see this stance by France and Germany perhaps sparking the rise of a broader conflict?
This is very standard rhetoric from the Russian side. It's been very consistent for the last 2 years that every time there is additional assistance being sent to Ukraine from Western countries, Putin or sometimes Medvedev will say something like this. It's part of a consistent strategy to raise the perception of a threat of a wider conflict and to get the Western countries to self-impose limitations on the assistance that they provide Ukraine.
Mr. Edith, Macron has, of course, distinguished between striking military targets from which Russia is targeting Ukraine and striking military targets otherwise. Now, it's a very fine line. What's to say that Ukraine maintains that line? And if it uses those weapons, targets other military facilities as well, we have an all-out war after that. Is it not playing with fire, as Mr. Putin said?
There is already an all-out war that is underway.
A larger
war
conflict.
that Russia is
A
waging
larger
on
conflict with
Ukraine.
NATO involvement.
What Russia is asking here is for Ukraine to restrain itself from attacking targets in Russia while Russia is unrestrained in the targets it can attack in Ukraine. That's not the recipe for a winnable war for Ukraine, and that's what Russia wants.
Mr. Harris, now the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, he made the case for allowing Ukraine to hit military bases a few miles inside Russia when he visited Kiev just a few days ago. However, the White House has now come out with a statement saying that it opposes Ukraine using U.S. weapons against Russia, with consensus around the U.S. policy fraying and pressure also mounting. Do you think that the U.S. will allow Ukraine to use American-made weapons against Russia?
It's a very fine line to walk.
Yes.
On the one hand, nobody in Washington wants a escalated war, wants a wider conflict to emerge. On the other hand, Ukraine has an absolute right to defend itself, and that should be allowed to use all the means at its disposal to do so. But within the framework of international law, which means to strike military targets and not civilian ones.
Mr. Edith, do you feel Ukraine has nothing left to lose at this point, because it is, there are high chances that Ukraine burns its own hands here, given the fact that US does not want an all-out war with Russia, and US is already in a certain amount of conflict with several nations where Russia has built its strong ties in the recent 2 years?
It's a decision that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people are going to have to make. On the one hand, it is tremendously disadvantageous in a military sense for Ukraine to suffer these attacks on its territory coming from Russia without any chance to hit back. On the other hand, Ukraine does not want to escalate and does not want to provoke a wider conflict. So it will be a question of finding a balance. What targets to hit inside Russia that would have the maximum military effect and would in some way inhibit Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine and the Ukrainian population without going too far in provoking that wider conflict.
All right. Thank you for joining in, John, and sharing all your insights. Of course, that was John Edith joining us from Washington, D.C., sharing all his insights. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much.